The racial categories of the US Census are seriously messed up. If they weren't so violently entrenched in law and economic reality, they would be laughable. This is a state-sponsored racial fan fiction, a bureaucratic kink chart for a ruling class that spent centuries using skin color as a ledger entry for who gets fucked over and who gets let in the door. This entire framework isn't about science, culture, or even history. It's about keeping the empire's taxonomies on labor, land theft, and manufactured racial tensions as operational as a goddamn slave ledger. Let's start with everyone's favorite. White. White isn't a race. It's an access pass to imperial dividends. This category is the most slippery, plasticine bullshit the US has ever produced. It shifts and expands whenever capital needs fresh bodies to enforce its racial caste system. 1790, white means Anglo-Saxons, English dudes who can own property and enslave people. 1800s, Irish, Italians, Jews, not white. They're too dirty, poor, and potential communists. Then in the 20th century, suddenly America needs more white bodies to fortify its capitalist hegemony. So Italians and Jews got a probationary whiteness card. Congratulations, you can now be racist to black people for a check. In the present day, whiteness is still a floating category, strategically managed to keep capitalism's core demographic strong. Its only consistency? That it's a lie. And how is this determined? Court rulings where judges pulled whiteness out of their ass. In Ozawa vs. US 1922, a Japanese man was told he wasn't white because he wasn't Caucasian. In the very next year, in US vs. Thin 1923, an Indian man was found Caucasian but still not white because whiteness is whatever the common man says it is. Literal legal racism by vibes. Now to America's least favorite category. Black or African American. Blackness in the US isn't so much an identity as it is a legal wound that you can't escape. The one-drop rule made sure of that. Unlike whiteness, which can stretch and contract like a capitalist sphincter, blackness is permanent. Why? Because capitalism needs a fixed bottom caste. The ruling class took an entire continent of peoples, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Zulu, Akan, and smushed them into one category that functions solely as America's bottom-tier labor force. A Haitian revolutionary? Black. A Somali immigrant? Black. A mixed-race person with a white parent? Still black. This was intentional. The more people that could be funneled into this caste, the more workers could be denied rights, wealth, and mobility. The census racial category reinforces this lumping. It doesn't recognize ethnic identity, only economic utility. Asian, a geopolitical dumpster fire of a category. Asian is proof that the census wasn't made for accuracy, it was made for imperial racial policing. Originally, Asian meant Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, because these were the groups most feared by America in its yellow peril propaganda. But later, US war priorities changed, and suddenly South Asians, previously classified separately, were thrown into the mix. Today, Asian refers to everyone from Filipinos to Arabs to Mongolians. Because the US treats the world like a risk board game where categories are based on whatever the State Department needs at the time. The categories make zero sense historically, biologically, or culturally. What does a Nepalese shepherd have in common with a Tokyo salaryman? Nothing. But, according to the US Census, they are racial twins. And let's not forget, Filipinos were originally counted as Malay until the US genocided their country. And suddenly they had to be shoehorned into an arbitrary Asian American identity. This isn't racial science, it's imperial map doodling. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. Yes, that's one category. This classification exists solely because the US stole Hawaii and colonized the Pacific. Before annexation, Native Hawaiians were sovereign, not a US racial category. But once the US swallowed their islands, the census had to create a new checkbox for them, because they were no longer Asian, but not quite Native American. It's the most transparent colonial category on the list. The US took entire island nations, put them under military rule, and shoved their people into a racial category classification like an afterthought. American Indian or Alaskan Native? Again, yes. One thing. Let's be clear. Native American is not a race. It's a legal status determined by the federal government. Unlike every other racial category, natives have to prove their ancestry through blood quantum, a literal percentage requirement like their fucking horse pedigrees. Why? Because the US wants to slowly erase native populations through intermarriage and make them legally extinct. That way tribal land and treaty obligations disappear. The entire legal apparatus of native identity is structured around land theft. The more that native is tied to government recognition and not actual ancestry, the easier it is to phase out indigenous land rights. And then lastly, some other race. This is where America hides the evidence that its racial categories are broken. Over 50% of Latinos check this category because they don't fit in any of the other nonsense boxes. Why? Because Latino isn't a race. It's a colonial aftershock. Latin America was built on Spanish caste systems where race was quite fluid. White-passing Latinos got elite privileges. Dark-skinned Latinos got shoved into plantation labor. Mestizos, mulattoes, and indigenous peoples got thrown into a racial purgatory where their classification was decided by economic status. The US Census inherited this clusterfuck, which is why it refuses to classify Latinos racially, and instead leaves them in a limbo category that proves the whole system is bullshit. The US racial classification system is not science. It's not even consistent. It's a damn capitalist filing cabinet designed to sort laborers, allocate oppression, and justify imperial expansion. The only thing it categorizes with 100% accuracy is who gets fucked over and who gets a free pass. This shit isn't fixable. It's not a mistake or a quirk of history. It's a designed tool of power, and the only rational response is to throw it into the fire and build a world where race is not a government-enforced hierarchy, but an actually material understanding of history, culture, and class. Cope.